2 years ago, I went on a hiking trip with my family around Mont Blanc in the French, Italian, and Swiss Alps. It was an incredibly memorable and wonderful trip, if also tough. And since then, we'd wanted to try something similar again. So in July this year, we headed to Switzerland to hike part of the Via Alpina, known as Bear Trek. We arrived in Zurich and took a number of trains to get to our first destination, Meiringen, where we would begin our hike. The town turned out to be famous for Sherlock Holmes, more specifically the Reichenbach Falls, where Sherlock Holmes meets his end in a final battle with Moriarty. I don't know why I didn't know this already, having read many Sherlock Holmes stories and having seen a Jeremy Brett film version, where, in the guise of Holmes, he falls to his death near this very waterfall. So we decided to deviate from the laid-out plan on our first day, which was the day after we arrived. Also after advice from a man we met at our first hotel, who told us the climb up was the best part. Whereas we might take a bus down 6 or 7 hours later. Up is muscle, down is pain, as he put it, and I couldn't agree more. Last time my knees had suffered on the downhill climbs, and I had taken a disturbing number of ibuprofens to get through them. On our first morning, we took an old cable car up to the top of the waterfall. No small feat for someone who's afraid of heights. The whole trip is a challenge when you're thus afflicted, but I had survived last time, and I knew I would again. Apropos survival, several people die hiking in the Alps every year. And we read about some at around the time we were there, not far from where we were going, so it's not something to take lightly. We could hear the waterfall from far away, a sound we heard over and over again during those days in Switzerland. A soothing yet powerful sound. We were the first people who took the cable car that morning, and the first and only people up by the waterfall that day that we saw. We hung around the first stretch of the waterfall for a while, admiring its thunderous existence, even locating a small star on the cliff wall, which probably marked the spot where Holmes fell from. From there we ascended the mountain up to the top of the waterfall, where, as I'd suspected, we had to cross it via a small bridge. It was less frightening than I had feared, and we climbed further up. We met a lot of animals along the way, something we always enjoy.
Nå, hej. Kom lige alle sammen. Hallo. Vi har ikke mad. Nå. Hej. Eller guten Tag.
It was foggy that first day, and as expected, there was a lot of uphill climbing. It's always especially tough the first few days because our muscles aren't used to it. Apart from some strength training and regular walking, there's simply no way you can train for hiking in the Alps in Denmark. There were waterfalls around almost every bend in the path, and we often stopped to admire the view or to catch our breath. It's not as popular a route as the Mont Blanc, so we often walk for hours without meeting a soul. It was just us and nature. Already that first day, we decided that Switzerland is surely one of the most beautiful countries in Europe, if not the world. And we repeated this sentiment to each other over the next 6 days. We don't lead especially hectic lives at home, because we've chosen not to. But our everyday lives still took a back seat when we found ourselves out in unspoiled nature for hours on end. It became a way of cultivating presence, quite automatically, because all you need to do is put one foot in front of the other and enjoy the journey. I saw plants in the wild that I have at home in my garden. We continually had to stay hydrated, which meant having to find bathroom pit stops along the way. Only rarely did we find proper ones, and often had to step behind a tree. We headed for a place called Gletscherschlucht, or Glacier Gorge, which was both impressive and terrifying. As we walked further and further into the mountain, I felt my familiar fear of heights, or fear of small precipices and steep gorges, not just for myself, but for my family.
Oh my God.
A few days later, we read of an experienced hiker who had died in the Swiss Alps falling into one of these waterfalls. I was grateful for the rails and wondered how someone had managed to build them. I tried to convince my family to turn around, but that was my own fear talking, and they wanted to walk on. I decided to stay put and wait for them. When they hadn't returned 20 minutes later, I began to worry. I tried texting them, but there was no reception. Then I decided to walk back out, trying to still my growing fear. And moments later they called me to say there was another way out and they would meet me at the entrance. I was grateful to be walking in more meadowy territory again, with them, to the sound of cowbells and a stream. From there we walked mostly up, through different landscapes, enjoying the temperature. You don't want it too hot when it's mostly uphill. We found no springs or taps to take more water from, as opposed to last time.
Yeah.
So we had to ration our water. During that week, we gradually felt that the climb up and down was steeper in Switzerland than elsewhere in the Alps, something that a Swiss woman confirmed to us on our last day. Anytime the path was more or less even, which it rarely was, it was something to be appreciated. The fog was coming closer as we were headed up the mountain. And suddenly we were in the fog. So we put on our rain gear and hoped for the best. It was late afternoon and our hotel was still many kilometers away, one we could only reach by scaling the mountain and walking back down it again. We were feeling a bit despondent by this time, knowing how far we still had to go and being gradually swallowed by the fog. We reached the top, an altitude of about 2,000 meters or 6,500 feet, and could hardly see the path before us. We knew we had hours of walking ahead of us and would reach our hotel late, until we saw a bus sign and decided that we had already walked enough and would prefer to be able to have dinner and a
Vi
good
nærmer
night's
os
sleep.
2000 meters højde, og det sigler og sigler. Vi er gået 16 kilometer nu.
We waited around in the mist for an hour until a bus miraculously appeared, and we, more or less gladly, paid the astronomical fare down to our destination, Gimmelwald. Relieved and grateful to be at our hotel, we marveled at our view and had a simple meal consisting mainly of pasta. The fog was beginning to disappear, and not for the last time I was reminded of Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain, which takes place in the Alps and where the people staying at the sanatorium are constantly at the mercy of the elements, especially the fog, which creeps in at a moment's notice, something we discovered several times during that week. It's somehow both disconcerting and magical. It's nature doing its thing, and we're just small humans. The next morning the fog had lifted completely, and we gaped as we looked out the window. Now we could clearly see the summits of the three mountains that area and the trek is famous for: Eiger, Mönch and Jungfrau. The Alps will never cease to amaze me, so awe-inspiring, majestic and beautiful. The whole area is on the UNESCO World Heritage List. We left our luggage at the reception before 8 a.m. as usual, so that it would be carted off to our next hotel. And after a hearty breakfast, we set off for the day's hike, now bathed in sunshine, which proved to be almost as challenging as being immersed in fog, at least uphill. My daughter thought Grindelwald, from our new vantage point, looked like a Lego town, and that the train, too, looked toy-like. The train station, located at the highest altitude in Europe, was close by, and we experienced several times a train ride surprisingly high up and down mountains, very unusual for Danes. There was quite a bit of panting and not much shade to be had. So when we reached a small, ideally placed cafe after a few hours, we enjoyed a rare soda and rested for a bit. Last time we hiked in the Alps, my walking sticks were almost as important to me as my hiking boots and running shoes, which I alternated between. And I appreciated them this time too. Consider that a recommendation if you enjoy hiking in high altitudes, or even in lower. You get momentum on the way up and support on the way down, and you get to use your arms as well as your legs. We often heard the cowbells long before we saw the cows themselves. Often they weren't fenced in, so we had to walk among them, and it seemed hard to believe that cows can actually be very dangerous. They seemed gentle, and of course, used to humans. It was like entering a Milka chocolate commercial. The hike, by the way, is of course self-guided, and we navigated by means of an app on our phone, Gaibo, and there were often signposts. Unlike last time, we never got lost.
Grindelwald, down there where we began this morning.
We arrived in the town of Wengen mid-late afternoon, once again appreciating all the wooden Alpine houses and another stunning view from our hotel room. We talked often of what it must be like to have such a view every day. We started early the next day, as per usual. met some llamas, and began the long, steep downward descent to the town of Lauterbrunnen. The views were once again spectacular, something which you begin to get used to. Beauty is constant. We passed a school where it seemed the children had just been let out for the summer. Another school with a view. From Lauterbrunnen we took the train to Interlaken, partly deviating from the day's program again because a cable car connection had been cancelled due to snow lingering in the passes, and partly because the day's hike was over 22 kilometers, and partly to make it less strenuous for our daughter. It lifted her spirit. A hiking trip wasn't exactly what she meant when she had suggested a trip to southern Europe. But we also enjoyed seeing a little more of Switzerland and walking on an even sidewalk, just for a few hours. Interlaken was a very pretty town, which reminded me of something from Beauty and the Beast, especially the old part of town, where we saw surprisingly few tourists. After lunch and an ice cream, we hopped back on a train to Spitz, where we changed trains to Reichenbach, and from there we took a bus headed to Kiental, but hopped off about 8 kilometers from our final destination in Grisalp. We could have taken a bus all the way, but it was a hiking trip. We started out on a small road, then left it and climbed steeply upwards again.
I am something as rare as off-grid right now. There's no reception, and I'm actually fine with that.
Switzerland has one stunning valley after another, and once again we were on our own, up a mountain. Occasionally we could hear a waterfall on the other side of the valley, but as yet we couldn't see any villages or even isolated houses that might be Grisalp, our final destination that day. That's a constant aspect of hiking in the Alps, not knowing what's around the next corner or when the day's hike will be over, and accepting that is crucial. We met some more llamas, or possibly alpacas, and were beginning to feel tired by this point. We had a hard time finding our hotel. Hostel was perhaps more accurate. And when we finally did, we were a little surprised.
I don't want to say primitive.
There were other hikers staying there, and it reminded me of my backpacking days long ago. The location was stunning and remote, and the hotel was over 100 years old, with exceptionally creaky stairs and floorboards, and we were on the second floor. There were only 3 electric sockets in the whole place that everyone had to charge their phones on. You realize how dependent you are on electricity. In our case, also for navigating tomorrow's hike.
Going upstairs, other person going to find a socket to actually charge his phone.
With paper-thin walls, we could hear every sound and didn't exactly sleep like babies. The next morning, we passed the steepest bus route in Europe, a 28% incline, then began descending into the valley. Passing some cows that had found water at a nearby waterfall, and then began a slow, long ascent up the mountain. We gradually left the valley behind and got closer to the snow-capped summits. Before we left Denmark, we'd been told that certain routes might have to change due to lingering snow in the passes and possibly bad weather. But it was difficult to find updates on the weather situation up in the mountains, and the weather had so far been beautiful, so we continued upward. Then we met a man, a mountain guide of sorts, who told us that we should probably turn around. Part of the path further up had been destroyed and was covered in hard snow, and the forecast up in the pass said rain and possibly thunder and lightning. We were disappointed, of course, but also grateful that we happened to meet that man. So we had to walk all the way back to the valley you can see in the distance. A few days later, we once again read of a hiker who was killed up in a nearby mountain pass, this time by lightning. The man also told us there was a bus from Swiss Alps, where we had begun the day's hike some 3 hours earlier, so that was where we were headed. By the time we got there, it was raining, and 20 or so hikers, including us, all piled onto the bus, and so began a descent down the steepest bus route in Europe. The honking tune was to alert any oncoming traffic. After another train ride, we finally arrived in Kandersteg, had an early dinner and dessert, and had some time to walk around the little town. It was foggy, and we talked about the following day's hike. The weather situation had likely not improved up in the mountains, so once again we made alternative plans. The next morning the fog had completely descended on Kandersteg, and we were once again enveloped in the mist as we began the climb to Oeschinensee, an alpine lake which our navigation app had suggested as an alternative route if you'd missed it the previous day, which of course we had. It was somehow perfect, magical and moody in the fog. And when we arrived at the lake, a couple of hours later, we immediately understood why it's referred to as maybe the most beautiful lake in the Alps. The fog was still lingering. We left the main spot where groups of tourists stood and took photos and walked down to the little shore. The landscape looked almost surreal, and as we stood there taking it all in and had a snack, the fog began to lift and slowly revealed the tips of the surrounding mountains to us. It seemed like something from a fantasy novel, and it took our breath away. Only moments later the fog suddenly descended again, and the people we met on our way away from the lake would not be able to see those mountains at all. So we descended as we had climbed up, shrouded in the mist, which suited the landscape, the bare mountaintops, and later the tall dark green pine trees. I can hear people, but I can see no one. We found another route down that we had taken up, met some sheep and then some cows. back in Kandersteg, we paid a visit to another small konditorei, which we'd eyed the day before, and enjoyed a magnificent chocolate mousse cake, which we felt we deserved. They had a house cat named Findus, like our own cat at home. Thus fortified, we hopped on a bus to Adelboden, riding through another stunning valley to get there. It was a lovely little alpine town, and we again wished we had had more time to properly see the place. But we made use of the time we had and enjoyed another stunning view from our hotel. There's a reason why the sanatorium in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain is located in the Alps. It's healing to be in the mountains. Their majestic, awe-inspiring presence takes you out of yourself, makes you forget yourself, while at the same time making you feel more yourself because you feel more present, if small, next to the mountains. That was a good thing because I woke up feeling exhausted and unwell. I thought it was just fatigue from the by now close to 100 kilometers that we had hiked, possibly lack of sleep, and maybe the beginning of a fog-induced cold. My partner too felt uncharacteristically weary, and we both took a painkiller or two to get through the day's hike. I still enjoyed the beauty of the landscape, but was finding it a bit harder, not easier as expected, to walk. A Coca-Cola at the top of the pass had never tasted so good. We took in the final views as we began the descent, which proved positively grueling for me.
We still have to walk all the way down there to that village. Holy moly.
When we finally reached our hotel in Link, I went to bed and slept until the next morning. Only back in Denmark did we realize that we had probably had COVID. We said goodbye to the Alps and headed north, through Bern, the capital city of Switzerland, to Zurich, where we had a late flight. Although I was far from well, we stored our luggage at the station and went out to see a bit of Zurich. I had visited the town 30 years ago, but remembered next to nothing. We immediately found a small konditorei and had some delicious cake and ice cream, and lots of water, which was needed. It was 32 degrees Celsius, or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and we were melting. I checked out the map on my phone to find out what to see in Zurich if you only had a few hours, and so we headed to the old part of town. It was beautiful, and though we were exhausted from the hike and from COVID, we wished we'd had more time to really explore the city. But it was a taste of Zurich, or Zurich, the most populous city in Switzerland, with foreign nationals making up about a third of the population. The difference between the landscapes we had just spent so much time in and then bustling urban Zurich was striking. And though it felt strange walking among so many people suddenly, we appreciated getting a fuller picture of Switzerland, a country that we truly loved spending time in and will gladly visit again someday.